I would like to invite Professor Dr. John Everatt from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, to present his research on early assessment and intervention of specific literacy learning difficulties within multilingual learning contexts. Let me just give you a short introduction on Dr. John Everatt. He received a PhD from the University of Nottingham, UK, and has lectured on education and psychology programs at universities in New Zealand and the UK. His research focuses primarily on literacy acquisition and developmental learning difficulties. His current work is investigating the relationship between literacy and language by considering how the characteristics of different scripts might lead to variations in learning and acquisition.
Thank you. Okay. Right, I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing initially around the world, and then focus in on the current work that we're doing in New Zealand. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through the first part of the talk, so forgive me, because it's mostly background, and then talk about some of the data that we've been collecting in New Zealand to focus in on some of the issues that we are looking at there. So, as I say, forgive me a little bit if I go a bit quickly to begin with. It will slow down. Right. Wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what I see specific learning difficulties as. For me, the sort of research that I do focuses mainly on literacy. I'm mostly interested in dyslexia, so most of the work that I do, it looks at word reading, word spelling. But we've been doing quite a bit of work in New Zealand on reading comprehension, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm not going to talk anything about the writing and the maths work that we've been doing over the past few years, but that we have been looking at writing ability across multilinguals and even maths ability across multilinguals. The primary work, obviously, that we're doing is trying to identify individuals with these sorts of problems so we can reduce the problems. So, as I say, dyslexia is the main focus of the work that I do. This is my view on dyslexia. It's stolen from several other people's views, but I don't care. The key point here, though, is the focus on accurate and fluent reading. Problems that occur despite an educational context in which other children in the same classroom are learning okay and a particular child is struggling. For me, the main underlying interest is looking at the relationship between these literacy problems and language, and therefore that has focused much of the work that I've done over the last few years on phonological difficulties, but also the idea that just because a child has dyslexia doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be bad at everything. So here's the sort of data that I've collected in the past that have led to that sort of overall conclusion. And obviously the primary thing is reading and spelling problems, typically related to phonological weaknesses, but not necessarily related to weaknesses in other areas. That black line at 0 is what we would expect the performance of these children to be if they were following a normal trajectory of development, and the blue dots are the dyslexic groups. This is data from a large number of dyslexic kids in the UK. Okay, so which button? That one. The key to this, and the reason why I'm interested in the phonological aspects, is because this is a skill that's not necessarily reliant on literacy. So this is the skill of being able to recognize phonology, to be able to recognize basic sounds within words, is a language skill. It's a skill that the child can potentially develop before they are learning to be literate. And one of the reasons for looking much more at this particular skill is because this enables us, or has the potential to enable us, to identify a child before they're going into a literacy class, before they are required to learn to read. So it's not necessarily going to be a skill that that we have to wait for them to struggle with literacy before we identify the problems. So that's the reason for focusing on phonological awareness, the ability to hear basic sounds within words. It gives us the potential for identifying early. So if this phonological awareness idea is correct, we can identify early, And then the other aspect to it, if it is the underlying reason why children are struggling with literacy learning, maybe if we can identify it, we can remediate it. We can do an appropriate intervention to support the children in those areas. Now, that was my basic starting point of the sorts of work that I've been doing over X number of years. But as I said, the main thing that I'm really interested in is how we can identify and support kids who are learning in a multilingual context. Most of the data that I just presented you was based on English monolingual kids primarily, and the sort of work that we did in the UK with primarily monolingual English children. Once you start looking at children who are learning several languages and maybe even learning to be literate in several languages, then that simple idea that I presented you with of the relationship between phonology and literacy actually becomes a little bit more complex. There's two basic reasons for that. One is that it's not a simple relationship where phonology leads to literacy. There's also elements of literacy supporting the development of phonological awareness. So there's more of a cross-relationship between the two. So it's not as simple as I said earlier on. The second is that the relationship between phonology, the language that a child is speaking, and literacy, the language that they're learning to be literate in, the orthography that they're learning to be literate with, differs across different languages, across different orthographies. And that difference potentially can then lead to difference in the relationship between phonology and literacy. So what we did to begin with was look at large numbers of children from relatively monolingual backgrounds as well, to try to identify whether this phonological awareness skill was something that could be predictive of literacy levels across these different languages. And we mainly chose languages that varied in terms of the relationship between basic letters within the orthography and basic sounds within the language. And the more transparent the orthography, the easier the relationship between letters and sounds is. And we tried to vary that. Basically, what we found was that in most cases, although the level of prediction varied across different orthographies, we could still find phonological awareness, measures of phonological awareness skills to be predictive of word-level literacy, dependent on how you measured it. In some cases, it was easier if we measured fluency rather than accuracy, but certainly the ability to deal with individual words within the orthography was related to these phonological awareness skills. That's good news, but we'll know. We've also done this across a large number of bilingual backgrounds, looking at, again, whether we can predict literacy levels based on phonological awareness measures, and look at different groups in terms of them learning in terms of them learning a more transparent orthography versus a less transparent orthography. Most of the research had English as the second language, mainly because that's the context within which I was working. But we've looked at other languages, other language contexts later on as well. And again, the primary finding, although the amount of variability in reading levels varies, primarily these phonological awareness skills do seem to be somewhat predictive of literacy levels. So that's the general background, if you like. That's the sort of the worldwide stuff that we've been doing. And again, it's coming up with these basic skills, this basic understanding of sounds within the language seem to support literacy learning. So what we've been doing in New Zealand is trying to put that into practice, that idea into practice. So we've been going into schools around New Zealand, and New Zealand is becoming a very multilingual, multicultural country with people from lots of backgrounds, including myself. I'm an immigrant to New Zealand as well. So we've been looking at lots of different kids from lots of different backgrounds. All of these children have started school in a New Zealand context, so they're age 5 when they start school. Around about, some of them a little bit later, but normally it's around about 5 when they're starting school in New Zealand. And then we're looking at whether we can use these phonological skills and maybe other measures of literacy-related skills to identify those who might struggle. We've looked at the Persian, Arabic, Indian contexts is important. I'll explain that in a second, because what we've also done is not only looked at kids in New Zealand, but we've then looked at similar contexts of the same sorts of languages within the background country as well. So we've gone to Kuwait, we've gone to Iran, we've gone to India, we've gone to several other places to see whether the findings that we're getting in New Zealand with multilingual kids are also the same sorts of findings we get with similar sorts of kids within the home country, within the home language situation. So that's basically what we've been doing. What we've been trying to do is whereas the previous research we've been messing around with the sorts of measures that we've been doing to try to get the best measure for the context, what we've been trying to do here is have a bit more systematic set of measures that we can use so that it's easier to directly compare the results. So we've been using a lot of different measures. The key ones here is that we've also been looking at reading comprehension as much as word reading. We've been looking at some language skills as well, mainly English language skills. We've obviously been looking at the phonological awareness stuff, as in the previous ones, and then we've been looking at some orthographic processing, how the child can recognise and process the orthography, some morphological skills, how a child recognises basic morphemes, basic meaning units within the language, and then some rapid naming measures. So this is our data from New Zealand. This is several schools that we've gone into, and we've looked at basically kids who are English speakers, mainly monolingual English speakers, and that's the red bar in each of these particular contexts. And then we've looked at kids who are speaking another language at home. So they're learning English, they're learning in an English medium school, but English is not their only language that they're working with. The two green bars will become clear in a second. I'll explain that in a second. Basically, what we're finding, though, with these kids who have started school relatively early is that the primary difference between the monolingual English speakers and the bilingual, multilingual English speakers is primarily in certain areas of meaning understanding, mainly in vocabulary. So typical of a bilingual or multilingual child, the vocabulary in the one language may not be as good as the vocabulary of monolingual English kids. If you add the vocabulary knowledge across the different languages, they've probably got bigger sets of vocabulary if you multiply the languages. But within English, the primary difference is in vocabulary. The interesting point here, though, is that there's very few differences in the more orthography areas that we've been looking at. So although vocabulary may be an issue for our multilingual learners in New Zealand, they're still acquiring the ability to process text in a way that is consistent with their monolingual peers, which might not be too surprising given that these are early kids. You know, we're testing kids at 5, 6, 7, those early years of learning. But that's the important point here, that with these big sets of data, we're getting consistency in these literacy areas. What we've also tried to do, though, is then try to model all of these different contexts to see if we can work out what are going to be the good predictors of these areas of literacy and what might be things that we might target in our intervention work. For the English data, these are English monolingual kids, we typically get two basic areas, predicting reading comprehension and phonological and orthographic skills being related to word reading, and more language skills, particularly vocabulary, being related to sort of an overarching language area. Vocabulary also seems to be related to word knowledge in these young kids as well. So a child with decent English vocabulary also can recognise written words easier. This is the reason why there were two different green bars. The one green bar were those kids who I've categorised as coming from an Indian Arabic background. And this is because the sorts of relationship between individual letters, individual written symbols, and the language are maybe easier to spot than in the next group that I'm going to talk about, the other bar. Here, though, the interesting element that we're getting is some basically the same sort of overarching model as the English version. You can see when I swap them over, there's not a great deal of difference between the two, apart from this orthographic effect, which I think might be interesting in terms of Indian background language, Arabic orthography background languages. There's something special about the orthography, which I think might be consistent with what the first speaker was talking about there, that there's something interesting about the orthography, the processing of the orthography by these kids that's influencing not only their word level ability, but also their ability to deal with text. Maybe an individual word is easy in terms of orthography, but when you've got text sentences and they're young kids, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, it's more complex, and your orthographic abilities are also important. The interesting one is the Chinese background group. This is the other group in the first slide, the other green bar. These are kids who have come from a background where they've been potentially exposed to Chinese characters that don't have that nice simple relationship between a character and a sound. Now we've got whole characters that represent whole words, so there's not that simple transparency relationship that I talked about earlier. Here we get a slightly different model. For some reason, we're getting less effects of word reading on reading comprehension. It is there, but it's much smaller than I would have predicted. And what we're getting is an ability to understand these phonological skills supporting reading comprehension. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but I think that might have something to do with they've been taught different types of radicals, and they might be using some types of radical processing to be able to understand text in Chinese. And that might then, that skill in phonological awareness is not only important then for word reading, but it might also be slightly important for comprehending. If you can pronounce something based on the phonological radical, maybe you can make a good guess as to what it means, even if you've never seen the character before. That's a bit of a guess. But remember, these are kids in New Zealand, so they're still learning within a context of New Zealand. But the more interesting thing, I think, here, and the one that I can explain better, which is the reason why it's more interesting, is the morphology effect. And that seems to be fairly consistent with what you would find within a Chinese character learning situation, where the morphological unit of the character is possibly as important, if not more important, than some of the phonological aspects of the written character. So I'm not surprised that we're getting morphology coming out with the Chinese groups as well. So what we've done is, as I say, we then went into the different background areas of these kids, and we found very similar findings with children who are from a sort of a home orthography background. So these are kids who are learning an Arabic orthography, and they're showing, very similar to our bilingual kids, they're showing this interesting influence of orthography on comprehension. We're also getting a few bits of speed of processing in there, which I'm not entirely sure I understand, but anyway, it's in there. Kids who are learning an Arabic language and an Arabic orthography, again, there's that element of orthographic processing supporting reading comprehension, so we're getting a similar sort of effect there. We're getting an increase in morphosyntactic skills for these Q80 kids, which I'm not entirely sure of, but basically the same sort of general profile that we find with our bilingual kids. We've also been going into context in India to look at how kids who are from a trilingual background may be performing in English. So here we've got data again that's showing this relationship between these two skills, these two basic skills in reading comprehension. And then we're getting some crossover between the different languages. So English is the black arrow, and then the other first and second languages of these kids are the coloured arrows. And there is, therefore, consistent with what I suppose I'm arguing here, is that there is this interrelationship between the background languages or the background orthographies and their skills within the language that I'm testing them on. So there is an interaction here going on, which is the basic conclusion I suppose I'm going to make. And then basically that's led us to this point where we've developed some models that look at how English development is occurring within a multilingual context. We're finding very similar effects in our bilingual group compared to background groups within other countries. There's still the key importance there of phonological processing in most of these contexts. Even in the Chinese context, we're still getting phonological processing being important. But there is a first language issue. So for me, the sorts of things that we'd be looking at in terms of an assessment practice would again obviously be focusing on literacy, it would be focusing on phonology, but we then might want to also focus on characteristics of the first language that the child is using, because those first language characteristics may also help us explain variability in their literacy ability. So, final stage of the work that we're doing now that we've got a sort of an assessment program together, we've then been looking at how this might support learning within the children. So the obvious things that we're going to be doing is that we're going to be targeting phonology to support learning. But because of that vocabulary influence in there, particularly in that first slide where I said the main difference we're finding between the monolingual and the bilingual kids is in vocabulary areas, we're going to use these phonology type training aspects to then support vocabulary by training them on new words to support the learning of vocabulary as well as phonology. We're halfway through that piece of research now, but it's looking like it's performing as we might expect, that combination is doing better than individual measures, individual interventions. And final slide, sorry, I have to put that up because they don't pay me if I don't. Thank you very much. Okay. You can have this back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Dr. John, can we invite our Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Suchao, to give you a token of appreciation? Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.